There's no undoing this episode, folks, because we are going to talk about HBO's The Undoing. Welcome back to another episode of Biking and Blabbing. I'm Cycling Mike. So, HBO put out this mini-series called The Undoing, starring Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman in October this year. And it's like you got two murder mystery shows from HBO. You got this one and you got The Flight Attendant. I've yet to watch The Flight Attendant, but I did watch this one. I finished it this week. It took me a few weeks. I mean, it shouldn't have taken me a few weeks, but I like having... I'm one of these people that doesn't like to binge watch because I like doing like an episode a night, and I like thinking about like the suspense or the cliffhanger of the episode, which this show has some really good cliffhangers. There's some of them in there that are okay, but there's some really good ones. I think the cliffhanger for like episode 3, like really, I mean, well, the cliffhanger for episode 1. I imagine like that cliffhanger is nothing, but no, that's a big cliffhanger. But before we get on about the cliffhanger, let's talk about the show, what it's about, and why I like it so much. So episode 1, so this show's called The Undoing, and as I said, it starred Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman, and it's a murder, it's a murder mystery show done by by HBO, of course, and it starts out, there's this school with all these kids. It's like this private school known as Reardon, and Nicole Kidman's character, Grace Fraser, is the head of the auction committee. She makes sure that the school, makes its fundraiser every year and everything. So there's this new woman known as Amelia Alvarez. Her son Miguel has been enrolled in the school, and they're new to Reardon, and so she comes and she decides that she wants to be a part of the auction committee. And so Grace is like, yeah, no big deal, and so they start on the auction committee, and some of her friends think she's kind of weird, like Sylvia, and so that happens, and then she comes to they do the event, and Hugh Grant, who plays Jonathan Fraser, who's an oncologist, a children's oncologist, he goes to the big fundraiser at the beginning of in episode 1, and he hates doing the fundraisers. But he's not putting out any money. The interesting thing about this is like an expensive private school, but he's not putting out any money for the private school. That's Grace's father who's putting out money for the school. He's paying for his kids, or for his grandson's tuition. He's not paying. Jonathan is not fitting any of the bills, which is really interesting because you think an oncologist, after being in practice for a certain number of years, or a child's oncologist, would be able to afford, without his father-in-law's help, a private school like Reardon. And as it turns out, Henry's like one of their... Jonathan and Grace's son is one of the best students at Reardon. So that all comes into play later on in the show. But so episode 1 happens. They do the fundraiser night, and at the fundraiser night, Amelia Alvarez kisses Grace during the fundraiser, and Jonathan leaves during the fundraiser, gets uncomfortable for whatever reason, which seems unknown until, of course, the series progresses. So wait a second here, I'm going to get out of the way of these people. Shit, I'm really in their way. Park, damn it. Hang on, pause for the cause. There we go. Okay. So he leaves, and he's uncomfortable, and Grace is kissed by Amelia Alvarez. And it's actually, the show opens with her son Miguel finding her dead, but you don't know that is a flashback until the episode progresses. The show does one of these things that I really love when TV shows do this, which is it allows the story to set the time. HBO, I think, is really good about, like with Westworld. Westworld's a great example. I don't think HBO wants, this probably isn't a rule, but I don't think it really wants its creators, its writers and filmmakers, when dealing with the past, to change the cinematography in any way, shape, or form. It wants time to be understood through the dialogue and characters, not through cinematography. Which I've seen it done through cinematography before, or, even in black and white, and it was really cool. But I think when you don't do that, you don't change the lenses or the way the show looks when you're changing time, it really allows for the audience it forces the audience to pay attention. I know it confuses a lot of people, but it really makes them pay attention to the show, which I think is better. I think it really. So when you watch the opening scene, when the audience watches the opening scene, Miguel finding his mother dead in her art studio, because she is an artist, you don't recognize it as a flashback until after you find out that she's died, or even until after. Yeah, you have to know that. Yeah, until after she's died, because I didn't even know. You don't really know her name or Miguel's name. You don't know that the kid that comes and finds her in the studio is her son, because they don't really show the studio. They don't show the body. They just show that he found something, and he discovered her, and he goes and tells his dad. That's all we know in the beginning moments of the series. So the fundraiser happens, and Grace is kissed by Alvarez, and then the night happens. The night goes on. Grace crawls into bed. Jonathan crawls in bed with her, and it is found out that. Or no, that's right. That's not true. Jonathan is on a business trip. That's the reason that he says he's leaving the. I'm sorry. That's the reason he says he's leaving the fun. Oh no, that's not. That's not true at all. So he goes into bed. That's right. Okay. I'm sorry, I screwed up the series of events here. So he goes in. So Jonathan sleeps with Grace that night of the murder. Then that following day, he leaves for his oncology convention, and then when Grace learns about the murder, she tries to call Jonathan, and in the process of calling Jonathan, she realizes that the number in the hotel that he gave her is not correct. His number is not correct. It's picked up by a mysterious Jonathan Fraser, not her Jonathan Fraser. All this stuff, which, by the way, was really interesting in the moment, but none of it, other than to find out that she doesn't know who he is, the person on the other end of the line, none of that stuff comes into play ever again in the series. And how he was able to sort of manipulate his wife and create this alias or other person whose name is really Jonathan Fraser, even though he doesn't sound like Hugh Grant. So we learn at the end of the episode that Jonathan's not who he says he was, which I think people could, now watching the show, people could have seen coming. And so then we move on to episode 2. And in episode 2, Grace is interrogated by the cops. She's going to get a lawyer. Her father is, big-time millionaire. We don't really know how he got his money. That's never really explained, but he's got some money. And Henry just, he's talking about Reardon, and people think it's school, and the cops show up at the house, and it's just all this this craziness. They think that Jonathan did it. So, I remember what cliff here. So we go from there, and the great thing about episode 2 is you don't see Jonathan until the final minutes of the episode. That's one of the great things about him, because he goes MIA. They can't find him. They need to find Jonathan because he's the father of a Reardon student. And this is even though the murder didn't happen at the school, the girl goes to the school, and it's a Reardon parent that was murdered, so it becomes very much a school issue, which I have to say that's one of the greatest things about this series, is how involved, even though it's a secondary setting in a lot of ways, how involved the school is to the story. And there are things that play out at the school that I think are details that could have been left out in the show, still would have been great, or put in the show. It gives such depth to the show, the school itself. I almost kind of wish that she was murdered at the school, because that would have just the whole school it's such a haunting setting, a lot more haunting, I think, than the art studio is. So they go through this stuff, and Grace and Henry go to this summer home that her father owns, which you don't really learn that, I don't think, until the end of the series. So they go there, and she is startled by Jonathan. He sort of captures her in his hand, covers her mouth and says, "Don't scream. I'm here." And she said, "Why did you run?" And he says, "Well, I just did, but I'm innocent." Which sort of, I wish that his reason for running was better. That's one of the things that I think, as far as criticism goes, I wish that the reason that he ran, there was a better reason for it, other than just, I ran because I could run and I'm not innocent. Because his lie isn't that good. And I think if somebody was going to run, even, when they're lying, they're able to come up with a better lie than what Jonathan Fraser was able to come up with. So, and I think he's a much more intelligent man to come up with with the lie than what he came up with. So they call the cops. He's arrested. So that's the cliffhanger for episode 2. So then from there, they call the cops. Cops show up. He's arrested. All this stuff happens, and he has these meetings in his jail cell with Grace and with his attorney, because he gets a crap attorney because he's he can't afford a good attorney. So then he tells his wife in the final moments of episode 2 that he was unfaithful. We learn now that him and Elena had a relationship, and he says that he didn't want anything to do with her, that he called off the relationship, and that she stalked him, and she wanted it to be him, her, and Grace, and Henry. She wanted, and Miguel. She wanted a family she wanted to be a part of Jonathan's family, as well as Jonathan's lover. So there's all these really interesting things that go on, and throughout this time, too, Grace is having these fantasies of exploring her sexuality and, becoming more bisexual, possibly. So, in episode 3, he's arrested and he's jailed, and they start interrogating Grace again, and they're looking into Jonathan really heavily, and he keeps saying, why don't you look into her husband? And they said he's been exonerated, his alibi checks out. He was at home the night, and he's like, how is it a checked out alibi? He could have gone to the studio, all that stuff. So they have a meeting. So Grace, or his attorney, shows up, and he tells his attorney that he was unfaithful, but he did not murder Elena. And they have to come up with a reason for why he ran. All this stuff happens, and he gets into a fight at the jail. But the really interesting thing is that Miguel's father shows up at the end of the episode at Grace's house. And, at the house that her and Jonathan share. Because there's like 3 houses that go on in this series. We'll get to the third one in a second, because it really hasn't come into play yet in the story. So, he's there, and he explains to Grace that they were not only just lovers, they had a child together. That the son that is his, that we know as his, is Jonathan's. Now, actually, one of the things that is revealed within episode 2, which I didn't get at, is that Jonathan knows Elena because Miguel was diagnosed with a tumor and survived Jonathan's miracle medical treatment that he developed, or some breakthrough treatment that he tried out. He survived. And they became lovers while Miguel was in the hospital. Which is such a despicable thing to do to somebody. You're a mother of a child, and you're going to be unfaithful to your husband while your child is in the hospital, potentially dying of cancer. And to be unfaithful with his doctor, and they view him as the miracle healer. So, also in episode 2, episode 1, I believe, there's talk of a dog, which will come into play later. About Henry not being able to get a dog because Jonathan accidentally killed the family dog when he was younger, and it's haunted him ever since. And so for that reason, Grace and Henry cannot have Grace and Henry cannot have a dog. There cannot be a dog in the house. So when Mr. Alvarez comes to the house, he tells her all this stuff, and that's sort of the end of episode 2. Or that is the end of episode 2, not sort of the end. So that's the end of episode 2. And in episode 3, we go more in, we move to... So episode 3 is when the conversation with Henry and his father happens in the jail cell. And I gotta say, one of the things that Hugh Grant does really well in the show is every time he says he loves his kid, I believe him less and less. He pretends to be this loving father when he's not this loving father. He doesn't really seem to take any interest in what Henry's doing. He doesn't really care about Reardon. He doesn't really care about Henry's studies. He has no interest in any of it. He is Mr. Oncologist of the Stars, and that's really all he gives a shit about. He doesn't really care about his wife that much either. He says he does, but I think when he says he loves Grace, I think there's probably more love for Grace than there is for Henry. As the series progresses, we don't really get to see a real unfolding of him and Henry's relationship until the end of the series. But we'll talk about that when we get there. So he has the meeting, and Henry just kind of, the entire time that Henry is there, he is standoffish with his dad. He doesn't really want anything to do with him. He believes he's guilty. One of the things I don't think is right about the show is, until maybe the later episodes, until probably more than halfway through, is people believe Jonathan killed her the entire time. There's no, not even from Henry's perspective, there's no, well, maybe he didn't do it, maybe he was just unfaithful. As the audience, we sort of wonder that, because that's a fair thing for us to wonder, but the believability and how quick they are to convict him of the crime is I think, one of the negatives of the show, because nobody really gives Jonathan any benefit of the doubt in it at all. And one of the things, so that's actually one of the things I totally forgot to mention, is one of the things that comes up in episode 2, besides the lake house stuff, is she goes to the hospital. Grace goes to the hospital, and she sort of unravels this oncology convention that Jonathan created to get away, and finds out that Jonathan was fired from his job. This is a big part of it, so I totally forgot to mention. Jonathan is now unemployed. In episode 2, they find out that the reason he was unemployed has to do with his relationship with Amelia Alvarez, and that there was a lawsuit filed by the Alvarez family against the hospital and Jonathan's behavior. So they won the lawsuit, and to make everything go away, they fired Jonathan so their oncology department could stay intact. That was the deal. They're going to fire Jonathan. So Jonathan is unemployed. So Jonathan has no job. Now, so Mr. Alvarez comes to the apartment in episode 3. We have the conversation with Jonathan and Henry in episode 3. Henry doesn't really seem to believe anything Jonathan says in episode 3. And Grace goes before Jonathan, before Henry, and Jonathan wants Henry there. Jonathan wants his son. Jonathan is really sort of naive to his kid's intelligence, which I think is really apparent from image 1, scene 1, the way he speaks and his articulation. It's just so obvious that this kid, you're not going to be able to woo this kid over that the guilty guy is not guilty, and that because he's been a loving father to you, he doesn't exist. He's not a murderer in your eyes. He understands murder. He understands how serious his father's conviction is. He's no dummy, and nobody's really sugarcoated it for him either. He just knows that this is the thing, and this is bad news. He's about 10 or 11 too, so or probably 11. Yeah, I think he's 11 in the show. So he's not naive at all to Jonathan's behavior and what Jonathan is accused of in the series. So he asks for him, and Grace says no. And I think to a lot of people, they would not have brought their son while he was being tried to the jail cell. I think a lot of parents would have waited, and unless their kid really loved their dad, which, again, Henry doesn't seem to love him that much. He seems to accept him as a part of his life, but he doesn't really show any affection to him. Not as much as he does his mom. So he goes there and he tells him, you're full of shit. I don't believe you. Stop lying to me. And Jonathan's made all these promises to Henry over the years that he hasn't managed to keep to him because he's been busy with screwing other women or the oncology conference. So we get to the end of episode 3 happens. He comes and he tells about the kid. Mr. Alvarez tells him about the kid. And that's the basis of episode 3. Then we move on to episode 4. And episode 4 is where things really get interesting, because as far as Grace is concerned, because now it's not just, okay, you were home, you're a loving wife and mother, you're free to go, we don't believe you do this. Now it's like the interrogation is on Grace, because the cops, when they were surveilling, so they really start to interrogate her, and we start to look into. They get Jonathan a good attorney, and she starts talking to Grace and Jonathan, and they start prepping they start, discussing the possibility. And of course, Grace's father-in-law, or Jonathan's father-in-law, is paying for the attorney. He decided, I'm going to pay for the attorney, this is what's going to happen. Which, again, is a really bizarre thing, because like a lot of other people, Grace's father believes he killed the woman too. So there's nobody in the series. And I think Grace is doing it just because I think Grace doubts the entire time during the show, just because she has this picture of their perfect family in their head, and she's willing to keep that picture for as long as she possibly can, regardless of how unfaithful Jonathan's been. Because she'd rather do that than go through a divorce and, have to find another husband, put in all that work. So from there, they interrogate her. By the way, Grace is a clinical psychologist. She has a PhD in psychology. She's very, very standoffish with the cops. And her father and her are very much these people where we have more money than God. You can't touch us, which I really think is an interesting dynamic. I think making the Frasers, an upper class family is something that is important to the story, because whether you think Jonathan did it or not, or even if you think Jonathan did it, there's a big part of he's going to get away with this murder because they're going to pay off a bunch of lawyers or a judge, and he'll be free to go, and he'll be back with Grace and Henry at the end of the series, because he has the money to get good lawyers and pay it off, which, of course, again, he doesn't have that money he had with his father-in-law's. So they start interrogating Grace's father, and he tells him to shove it, and they finally ask her at the end of the episode, this is why we think you're guilty, is because we found you on the surveillance tape. We didn't find Jonathan, we found you. And she said, I didn't kill him, which again makes her a suspect, which I really sort of, at this point when I was watching the show, I wanted it not to be Jonathan, because I thought, especially with the kiss, I thought there could be some really interesting goings on where Amelia would have seduced both of them behind both of their backs, and Grace could have killed her because she wants to deny that she might possibly be bisexual. She doesn't want to explore that part of her sexuality, and so she killed Amelia possibly killed Amelia for forcing her or encouraging her to explore that part of her sexuality. But the show goes on. So then episode 4 comes through, and we have more to do with the attorney. Episode 4 we finally move into Grace's father's household, start, talking about the situation, the idea of maybe the marriage should be undone is a possibility, and she's sort of, well, maybe not, maybe he's not guilty, and there's not really much from Jonathan in this episode other than the fact that they're going to do a TV interview. Now, one of the interesting things is Sylvia wants to have a night with Grace and Henry and her daughter, who is friends with Henry, whose name I cannot remember. She wants to have a night where they all, have like a movie night or something. One of the things I thought was that they could have done that I sort of thought was interesting is we don't really see Sylvia's husband, so maybe Grace. I thought that, like, as far as exploration of sexuality goes, I thought there could be a point at which maybe Grace and Sylvia had a relationship going on, and that was also, she was cheating on Jonathan, maybe years or months before Jonathan ever met Mrs. Alvarez. And then that would be why she'd be willing to go and explore with Mrs. Alvarez. But none of that happened. I really sort of thought maybe there could be some kind of interesting relationship there. I wanted them to play with Grace's sexuality more than they did. It's something that there's a kiss in episode 1, as I talked about, and you can kind of tell she might be aroused by that kiss. And that's something that I really wanted them to explore. And they didn't do it. And the reason they didn't do it was because the focus of the show is on Jonathan. So they decide to have a TV interview. She decides it's the best thing. Oh, and in episode 4, this is they decide that Henry needs to leave Reardon. There's too much press around Reardon. It's not good for the school's publicity, and they think that it'd be best to pull him out of the school. So Grace's father comes in and tries to convince the school to let Henry stay. And he does so. And he said, it's not coming from me, it's coming from the board. Or no, he does not. He's not able to do so. The headmaster tells Grace's father, this is not coming from me, this is coming from the board. And Grace's father says, fuck the board. I can give them all the money in the world they want. I'm not gonna fundraise this school anymore. And that they need Henry in not only for academics, but they also need his financial, they need Grace's father's financial support. And he loses on that front, which I don't necessarily think Reardon needed it as much as her father thinks they do. I think they need Henry academics-wise more than they need the money. So, but they're not kicking him out of the school. They're not expelling him. They just want him to do his studies at home. So, Henry seems... And the reason this happens is because Henry has a conversation with Miguel where he apologizes for running into him. This, of course, is reported by Miguel to the headmaster, so they call Henry in, and Henry says, I apologize to him because I bumped into him. All this stuff, all that seems to be true. Henry doesn't really fight his suspension. He just accepts it as is, and that's it. And the series moves on. While in so at the end of episode 4, Jonathan does his TV news interview, and I start asking him, did you do it? No. How do you know you didn't do it? And one of the things that his attorney stresses for him is that he has to assure and be honest about the unfaithfulness to Grace. That has to come out, because he has to acknowledge it, because the media already knows. And they don't, he can't sit there on TV and lie to them about it when they already know it's true and people are talking. He has to confirm that, but he has to assure them that even though he was unfaithful to Grace and he had this relationship, that it doesn't make him a killer. And she said that's his best argument. So they ask him, do you know who killed Amelia Alvarez? And he said, yes, I do. And that kind of cliffhanger. I don't really like that cliffhanger, because it doesn't really... You never really get to see the end of the interview. And it just doesn't... It makes the show... Again, it makes the show feel like we're turning around, we're turning our eyes on another suspect. But then episode 5 happens. So episode 5 happens. Henry's doing his studies at school. Or not at school. He's doing his studies at home. And he's, doing well on the violin. And his father, or his grandfather, takes more interest in him as a student and as a grandson than his father, Jonathan Fraser, ever does. So there's a whole big thing in episode 5 has got a lot of stuff that happens. One of the big things is that Grace's father admits to her that he was unfaithful to her mother, which was something that they never knew about until... Well, it's just something that she never knew about. So then what happens is they also have a family meal. I keep wanting to get to the end, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in this episode story-wise. They have a family meal. Jonathan talks there. Henry talks about getting a dog and how when this is all over, they can get a dog again. And so Jonathan leaves. And when Jonathan leaves the table, it's a family dog thing, really upsets him. And Grace is like, well, you're upsetting him because you mentioned the dog, and it's hard on him. In this process, so when that happens, he goes off, and Grace follows him, and she talks to him and says, the dog must really be a big deal. He's like, no, the dog was alive. And one of the things that was brought up in the other episodes, especially by her father, was how well do you know your husband? You never met his... You didn't know he was fired from his oncology job. It's revealed that they don't know anything about Jonathan's family. All this stuff. So, in the restaurant, it's revealed that Jonathan was 14 and he had a 4-year-old sister. And when he had the 4-year-old, and while babysitting her one night, she went outside and was hit by a car, and he was blamed for her death, and he felt responsible for it. And, he was blamed for her death, and that sort of made him estranged with the rest of his family. So, after that's revealed, Grace ends up talking, has a conversation with his mother, talks to her via Zoom, calls her up and says, listen, I really need to talk to you about Jonathan. And we have this discussion. So the mother reveals to Grace that Jonathan did not grieve, was not upset at all about what had happened to his sister, and just sort of accepted her death. So it's determined that they now believe that Jonathan's a sociopath, and that, of course, complicates things. They have hearings, and they sort of... The defense is amazing. They really sort of, get everything kick-ass, and they're like, we don't know where the hammer is, because he beat the person, the perpetrator, that's the word, beat Amelia Alvarez on the head with a hammer. So they can't find the hammer. So they go through this whole thing, and while Grace is also at the house, or at her father's house, she learns that her father was unfaithful to her mother repeatedly, and that he never liked Jonathan because he saw the unfaithfulness in him. And while Henry is... So from there, they're like, they need to know where the hammer is. And they find it in Henry's violin case, because Henry plays the violin. And in doing so, Grace has to have answers. Then episode 6 comes about. They have a meeting about the hammer with the attorney. she doesn't want the hammer to be presented as evidence because she feels that that'll get Jonathan a faster guilty plea than she would like, and it would sort of destroy her case. So she said, well, you don't have to present this to the court. This is a missing hammer still, even though you know where it is. We also find out in episode 6 that Jonathan had relations with Amelia Alvarez at the summer home, which really upsets Grace's father. He calls him a son of a bitch. And so, of course, tensions are rising high because the case is with Jonathan, and the attorney continuously tells Grace and her father that in order for this to work, in order for her case to work, she has to present Grace and Jonathan as a loving couple. They have to hold hands, and they have to present a lie to the court. So in the process of doing this, and there's also stuff in episode 5 that there's a bit of information in episode 5 that Henry reveals that he saw Amelia and his father together at school. Saw them kissing. So when they talk about the hammer, Henry reveals that he found it in the summer home, nudged between a rock wall. So he says he didn't use it, and Jonathan is sort of accusing Henry definitely accuses Henry of being the murderer, which I thought was a really interesting idea, that the kid would go and, terrifying, but as far as plot's concerned, what a twist. The kid turned around and bludgeoned his dad's lover to death because he saw them both kissing at school. But again, that's not what happened. So from there, they deal with the hammer, and they have the court hearings. Henry takes the stand. Henry tells the entire truth, tells about the incident at school, tells that he believes his father, basically that his father's guilty. And again, his father when they find the hammer afterwards, he makes this plea: I'm going to take you on this road trip. Everything's going to be great. We're going to be, family again. And the idea of them being a happy family, even if the murder hadn't happened, they're not a happy family. They don't love each other. So they have the court hearings, and they're in the process of going through the evidence. And Henry, they don't want Henry on the stand because they believe he'll give away information. They said we can call him up as a witness because he's in the witness list. Henry gives the information, which sort of seals Jonathan's fate, letting him know that, I believe my father killed Amelia Alvarez, and here's why. So then the next day of court comes, they're not even done with the trial, and Jonathan's gone. He's missing. And he takes Henry off, and they're going to have a little day together. So they have this drive, this whole drive is like the climax of the entire series. It's really... And so he starts talking about how, Henry believes that he killed the woman, and he says, that wasn't the real me. And that's the only time in the entire series that he admits guilt, or that you have any evidence that he actually killed Amelia Alvarez. The rest of the stuff, even the hammer, is still circumstantial evidence. Henry could have put it there. Grace could have put it there. It could have been left there by the murderer because, Miguel's father, Mr. Alvarez, could have known about their summer home gatherings, but He admits it, and there's this really interesting sort of dissociative identity disorder that Jonathan brings about, which I think exists. I think he has multiple personalities. It's never really explored in the series, but I think he does have multiple personalities, and he shows him being forceful with her, and he says, you can't leave me, you can't tell your husband or I'll kill you, and that's exactly what he does. And so they play that out. That is actually... There are glimpses throughout the show of the past, of the night between Jonathan and Grace. And I think also Miguel's father. But those little flashes are not really enough to... They're not really honest memories, because you don't know, well, what is this person seeing? What aren't they seeing? Who are they seeing? Who are they seeing as the murderer? You don't really know. And so, I mean, all the stuff that Grace, all the stuff about, Grace and Amelia in bed, none of that is real. As far as the series goes, all of that is fantasy. That must all be fantasies she had just from the kiss, which is, she must have really been aroused. So, he takes Henry on this drive, he admits stuff, he's like ready to go through red lights and just crash his car, and everybody's after him. They get all the helicopters after him, and all the police are after him, SWAT teams and everything. Doesn't need Jonathan back in court. And this run is also like the first run. It's interesting how the runs sort of bookend the series. You had the run at the beginning of the series, and you have the run at the end. These runs really segment his guilt. The first one doesn't. The first one is like he's nervous a bit because he feels that, they find out that they had sexual relations, that he'll be considered a suspect, and so he runs. He's running from being interrogated by the cops. That's not a guilt run. This is a guilt run. This drive, this whole thing is a guilt. I'm guilty, we're going to go. And Henry, the entire time, is like, his father just thinks he's not thinking through the situation, and he keeps thinking Henry's intelligence is less than it is, and he's like, what are you going to do? The cops are going to get you. Somebody's going to arrest you. They have your license plate. They know what car you drive, and you have me in your car. So, one of the interesting things about, he does show, I think in these moments, this is the most love I think he shows for Jonathan in the entire show. You really can tell here that he cares about his kid, and he doesn't want anything to happen to him, and he doesn't want to lose him. He wants to be a father to him till the end of his life. So, they finally pull him over. Or no, they don't pull him over. He stops the car, and he gets off on, the Brooklyn Bridge, or whatever bridge. Because this does take place in Manhattan. I should have mentioned that earlier, but I didn't. So they get off on the bridge, and he decides he's going to jump. And one of the things I thought was interesting was I thought that there would possibly be a possibility he'd throw Henry over and he'd sacrifice Henry just so he wouldn't be arrested or whatever. I don't know what he was thinking of doing with Henry, other than to just take him for ice cream. He's still got to bring him back to Grace. He has to go back to his mother. This whole plan in that is terrible. He's going to reach the Canadian border, and the Canadians would then extradite him. But taking Jonathan with him, I guess that means that they wouldn't kill him. That's probably what it does. It protects his wife so he doesn't die. So he decides not to jump, and he has his last encounter with Grace tells him to get off, and she's like, get off the ledge. And so he does. He gets off the ledge because he loves Grace. He loves Grace more than Jonathan. So he gets off the ledge, and he sort of has his last-ditch efforts for, I love you, please, and again, he's screwed, because he's admitted to Henry that he killed Amelia Alvarez. In saying that wasn't the real me, that is a way of saying that he killed Mrs. Alvarez. So, by the way, the two cops that are in this show are very... When they keep suspecting Jonathan, they seem like bad cops because they won't look at any other suspects. But they're really actually cops that are doing their job correctly the entire time because they suspect the right person. And I watched, so he gets arrested. I'll talk about what I watched after a bit. He gets arrested, and Jonathan and Henry leave, and he goes off in the cop car. And that's, into custody. And that's the end of we don't really know what his sentence is. We don't know if he gets life or death. We don't know any of that. That's one of the interesting things I just realized. We don't know what his sentence is. They're trying to figure out if he's guilty or not guilty, and once they do, they got to figure out what his sentencing is. And they didn't finish the trial. There was no deliberation by the jury. And I think that's one of the interesting things is the show ends, but there's so many questions. You don't know what happens to the rest of Jonathan's life. And I think if they were to make, even though it's not, whatever happens next, we know that he's guilty. So there's no question anymore. The big question of who killed Amelia Alvarez is answered, which is the question of the show. Who killed her? Who did it? That's the question. And that's answered. So whatever happens, even though these characters are very interesting, whatever happens to Grace and Henry, or whatever happens to Jonathan, whatever kind of sentence he gets, none of that matters because we know Jonathan killed Amelia Alvarez. So he gets arrested. He's gone, and that's the end of the show. And Henry and Grace fly off into the sunset. Well, they're really sad sunset because he lost his father. So, at the end of the series, or at the end of the episode, they talk about how the writer, they do a little behind the scenes thing, and they talk about how the writers were working on the story as the episodes were being put out and put together, and that they were never handed a finished miniseries when they got the job. And I think that's interesting because I think it really sort of allows them to think about, is Jonathan the one who killed this woman? And I think that one of the things that they did really well on the front half and not so well on the back half was they explored people, they explored Grace a bit. They didn't really explore Henry all that often, or at all. He was never, when they found the hammer, there could have been this whole, sixth episode where you explore Henry and you go deep into him and what would his motives have been. And that just never happened. And I think the reason it never happened was because we get to the sociopath information in episode 5, which you gotta figure by episode 5, the writers have made up their mind as to who's the suspect, or not but who the perpetrator is. And that was that. And I am kind of disappointed that it was Jonathan, because it feels like, even though there are these interesting characters, it feels like the end result was disappointing in a way, because it's like, oh, it's Jonathan. So maybe it's not, because there was all this. I mean, especially, I remember watching episode 3, I believe it was. Yeah, episode 3. Where, maybe it was episode 4. Maybe it was episode 4. I think I got my episode cliffhangers on. I think episode 4 is where they show Grace's photo, and episode 3 is where they have the conversation. Where she has the conversation with Miguel's father. But anyway, she, I wish they would have explored her more than they did. And Henry, when that was revealed. But that is the show. I mean, that's The Undoing in a nutshell. If you want to watch The Undoing, then don't, obviously don't listen to this episode. I'll probably put that in the description because they didn't put it in the description here. But thank you all so much for watching. This is probably going to be my longest episode yet of biking and blabbing, and I will see you next time. Just wanted to get another episode out before Christmas and say Merry Christmas to everybody. And I'm so thrilled to have done this episode for you all. This is Cycling Mike signing off.